Clean it up. That's what you're paid for, right? The words didn't just land. They cut through the soft hum of jazz and the delicate clink of crystal like something sharp and out of place, freezing the moment mid-breath as Naomi Carter stood there, tray still balanced in her hand, a thin line of red wine slowly trailing down her wrist under the warm amber lights of the restaurant. A place where dinners cost more than her weekly paycheck and smiles were expected to be part of the service but never returned. And for a second, just a second, the room felt like it tilted, conversations fading into a dull echo as nearby guests turned their heads not out of concern, but curiosity, the kind that feeds on discomfort, the kind that watches without stepping in, while the man at table 12 leaned back in his chair with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, his cufflinks catching the light as if even they demanded attention, and beside him, his friends chuckled under their breath. The low laughter of people who had never been told no, who treated moments like this as entertainment, something to fill the silence between expensive courses, and Naomi didn't move. Not immediately, her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of the tray as she registered the weight of the gaze pressing down on her, the unspoken expectation that she would apologize, that she would shrink, that she would confirm exactly what they already believed about her without ever having to say it out loud. Because in places like this, meaning was rarely spoken directly. It was implied, layered beneath tone, posture, and the casual flick of a hand dismissing someone like they were part of the furniture, and Naomi had seen it all before, night after night, double shifts stretching past midnight, walking home with sore feet, and a mind that replayed moments like this on a loop she couldn't quite turn off. But tonight felt different, not louder, not crueler, just heavier, like something invisible had finally decided to settle instead of pass through. And as the manager glanced over from across the room, hesitating just long enough to reveal where his priorities lay, Naomi felt the familiar pull to step forward, to say the rehearsed apology, to wipe the table, to let the moment dissolve the way it always did, quietly, cleanly, like it never mattered in the first place. But then she heard her mother's voice, steady and unshaken, from years ago in a kitchen that never had enough but always had dignity, telling her, "You don't wait for respect, Naomi. You carry it with you." And something in her posture shifted, not dramatic, not loud, just enough that if you were paying attention, you'd notice the difference, the way her shoulders squared, the way her breathing slowed, the way her eyes lifted just slightly from the table to the man in front of her, not challenging, not submissive, just present, and that presence, quiet as it was, seemed to ripple outward in a way no one in the room quite understood yet, because power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited, just beneath the surface, for the exact moment when silence would speak louder than anything else, and somewhere in the back of the room, unnoticed until now, a man in a tailored dark suit set his glass down with a soft, deliberate motion, his gaze fixed not on the spectacle, but on Naomi herself, as if he had been watching long before anyone realized there was something worth seeing. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and fragile, like something about to snap, and Naomi could feel every second of it pressing against her skin as the man at the table tilted his head slightly, studying her now, no longer amused in the same careless way as before but curious, as if her stillness had interrupted the script he had expected her to follow. And for a moment he said nothing, his fingers tapping once against the edge of his glass before he let out a short laugh that did not quite match the tension in the air, telling his friends, "Look at that. She thinks she has attitude now." And the others leaned in, their attention sharpening, because moments like this were never really about the mistake. They were about control, about seeing how far someone could be pushed before they folded. And Naomi knew that game. She had learned it long before this job, learned it in classrooms where teachers mispronounced her name without trying to correct it, learned it in interviews where smiles faded the moment she walked in, learned it in the quiet spaces where people assumed she would not notice what was never said out loud. But tonight she did not lower her gaze. She did not rush to wipe the table. She simply stood there, present, her voice calm when it finally came, soft enough that it did not interrupt the room, yet steady enough that it could not be ignored. "I will take care of it," she said, not apologizing, not explaining, just stating what was already obvious. And something about that choice, that absence of submission, seemed to irritate him more than any argument could have, his smile tightening as he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice in a way that made the people closest to him lean in to catch it. "You should be grateful you are even here," he said, as if offering advice rather than a reminder. And across the room, the manager took a step closer, then stopped. Again, caught between stepping in and staying out, because protecting the image of the restaurant often meant protecting the wrong people. And Naomi noticed that too. The hesitation, the quiet calculation, the decision not to disrupt the comfort of those who paid the most. And for a second, she felt the weight of it all, the long hours, the expectations, the constant balancing act between keeping her job and keeping herself. But then something unexpected happened, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle shift in the energy of the room, like the air itself had changed direction, and it began at the back where the man in the dark suit finally moved, pushing his chair back with a quiet scrape that somehow carried farther than the laughter had, and one by one, without understanding why, people began to glance in that direction, their attention pulled not by noise but by presence, and he stood there for a moment, adjusting his jacket with a calm precision that suggested he was in no hurry at all, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed but deliberate. And when he took his first step forward, it was not rushed, not aggressive, just certain, as if the space between him and the table had already decided to make room. And Naomi saw him then, really saw him, not as another guest, not as part of the blur of faces that came and went every night, but as someone who was watching with intention, someone who had chosen this moment rather than stumbled into it. And though she did not yet know his name, there was something about the way the room responded, the way conversation softened, the way even the man at the table straightened just slightly, that made it clear this was not just another interruption. This was something else entirely, something that had been building quietly from the moment he set his glass down. And now, as he closed the distance with measured steps, the balance in the room began to shift in a way no one could quite stop. By the time he reached the table, the room had already given him space without being asked, as if something unspoken had passed between the guests, a quiet recognition that the moment no longer belonged to those who had created it. And the man who had been speaking so confidently just seconds ago now shifted slightly in his seat, his posture adjusting in a way that suggested he was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath him, while the others at the table exchanged quick glances, trying to place the figure approaching them, trying to understand why the energy had changed without any obvious signal. And Naomi stood exactly where she was, the tray still in her hand, the faint stain of wine drying against her skin, watching as the man in the suit stopped just beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, a position that did not overshadow her presence but instead acknowledged it. And for a brief moment he said nothing, his eyes moving from the table to Naomi and back again, taking in every detail with a calm focus that felt entirely different from the curiosity that had filled the room moments earlier. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not raised, not sharp, just steady, the kind of tone that did not need volume to carry authority. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, and the question was simple, almost neutral, but it landed with a weight that made the man at the table sit up straighter, his earlier confidence replaced with something more cautious, something measured, as he let out a small laugh, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "No problem at all," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just a minor service issue." And he glanced at Naomi as if that explanation should be enough, as if reducing the moment to something small would make it disappear. But the man in the suit did not look away, did not nod, did not accept the answer. Instead, his gaze remained steady, and in that silence the room seemed to lean in again, waiting, sensing that this exchange was not finished, and Naomi felt it too. The shift from spectacle to something more deliberate, something that no longer revolved around humiliation but around truth. And for the first time that night, she was not the center of attention in the way they had intended. She was simply part of the moment, no longer reduced, no longer invisible. And the man beside her turned slightly toward her, his expression softening just enough to signal that his next words were meant for her as much as anyone else. "Did you make a mistake?" he asked, not accusing, not leading, just offering her the space to answer for herself. And that question, simple as it was, carried something rare, something Naomi had not been given all night, the chance to speak without being interrupted, the chance to define the moment instead of reacting to it. And she took a breath, steady and controlled, her voice clear when she responded. "No, sir," she said, and there was no hesitation, no apology attached, just truth. And that answer seemed to settle something in the man beside her, as if it confirmed what he had already observed, and he nodded once, a small, decisive motion before turning back to the table, his presence no longer quiet but undeniable. And now when he spoke again the tone shifted, still calm but carrying a firmness that left no room for dismissal. "Then I suggest we address what actually happened," he said, and the words did not demand attention, they commanded it. And in that instant the balance in the room tipped fully, not with noise or force, but with clarity, as if the story everyone thought they were watching had just been rewritten without anyone realizing when it began. The words settled over the table with a quiet finality, and for a moment no one moved, as if the entire room had paused to see who would speak first, and the man who had been so certain just minutes ago now found himself searching for something to hold on to, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his glass before he set it down with a controlled motion, forcing a smile that no longer carried the same ease. "It is not that serious," he said, his tone lighter now, almost dismissive. But there was a subtle strain beneath it, the kind that revealed more than it concealed, and he gestured vaguely toward the table, toward the faint stain, toward Naomi as if she were still part of the problem he was trying to minimize. "It was just an accident," he added, hoping to shrink the moment back into something manageable, something that did not require attention. But the man in the suit did not mirror the smile, did not soften his stance. Instead, he remained exactly as he was, composed and unmoved, his gaze steady in a way that made avoidance impossible. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm precision, but now there was a sharper edge to it, not raised, not aggressive, just unmistakably clear. "An accident does not usually involve commentary," he said, and the simplicity of that statement landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it stripped the moment down to what it really was. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a choice, and that distinction hung in the air where everyone could feel it. And around the room the subtle reactions began to shift, heads turning a little more openly now, conversations no longer pretending to continue, because the balance of attention had changed completely, and Naomi felt it in the way the space around her no longer closed in but opened, giving her room to breathe in a way she had not realized she needed. And across from her the man let out another small laugh, but this one came quicker, less controlled. "Look, I think you are overreacting," he said, leaning back again as if distance could restore his confidence. "We are paying customers." And there it was, the line that had always worked before. The assumption that money settled everything, that it granted permission, that it placed him above correction. And for a brief second the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see if that argument would land the way it always had. But the man beside Naomi did not hesitate, did not step back. Instead, he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it, and when he answered, his tone did not rise. It narrowed, becoming more focused, more deliberate. "And that gives you the right to treat people how?" he asked, not loudly, not confrontationally, but with a clarity that demanded an answer rather than an escape. And this time the man at the table did not respond immediately, his expression shifting as he realized there was no easy way to dismiss the question without exposing himself further. And for the first time since the moment began, the confidence that had filled his voice earlier seemed to falter, replaced by something less certain, something that did not quite know where to stand. And Naomi watched it happen in real time, the subtle unraveling of control, not through force, not through humiliation, but through truth being placed exactly where it could not be ignored. And beside her the man in the suit remained steady, not stepping forward, not pressing harder than necessary, just holding the moment in place long enough for it to reveal itself completely. And in that stillness, the hierarchy that had defined the room just minutes ago no longer felt as solid as it once had, as if something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not simply be covered over and forgotten. The question did not disappear. It lingered, and in that silence the man at the table shifted again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if weighing every possible response and finding none of them as simple as they had been just moments ago. And the confidence that once filled his posture now seemed thinner, stretched, forced into place rather than naturally held. "We did not do anything wrong," he said finally, his tone firmer than before but lacking the same ease, as though repeating the statement might make it true. And one of his friends nodded quickly beside him, adding a quiet agreement under his breath, the kind that did not carry conviction but hoped to support it anyway. And across from them the man in the suit listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, not dismissive, not impressed, just attentive in a way that made every word feel measured. And when the response ended, he did not immediately reply. Instead, he let the silence return, letting their words settle fully before he spoke again. "Then it should be easy to explain," he said, and the simplicity of that statement removed any space left for deflection, because explanation required clarity, and clarity revealed intention, and intention could not hide behind laughter or tone. And the man at the table glanced briefly around, noticing now that more people were watching openly, that the quiet attention of the room had shifted into something more focused, more aware, and that realization seemed to press against him in a way he could not ignore, because what had started as a private moment of control had become something visible, something shared, and visibility changed everything. And Naomi stood there, still and composed, her presence no longer shrinking under the weight of attention but holding steady within it. And she could feel the shift not just in the room but within herself, the absence of that familiar urge to disappear, replaced instead by something quieter, stronger, a sense that the moment no longer belonged to those who had tried to define it for her. And the man in the suit turned slightly toward the table again, his voice calm, but now carrying a finality that made it clear the direction this was heading could not be reversed. "You addressed her in a way that was unnecessary," he said, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating what had already been seen, and the words landed without force yet carried weight precisely because of that restraint. And the man at the table opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused, the argument he had relied on earlier no longer fitting as cleanly into the shape of the moment. And for a brief second his eyes flicked toward Naomi, not with the same dismissiveness as before, but with something else, something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing her not as a role, but as a person for the first time. And that realization, subtle as it was, seemed to unsettle him more than any direct confrontation could have, because it shifted the foundation of the interaction itself. And beside her the man in the suit remained steady, not stepping into dominance, not raising his voice, simply holding the standard in place long enough for everyone to see it clearly. And as the room watched, the quiet certainty of that standard began to settle over the space, replacing the earlier tension with something more defined, more grounded. And in that moment the power that had once seemed so firmly held at the table no longer felt secure, no longer unquestioned, but instead exposed, measured, and waiting for what would come next. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt intentional, like something had settled into place and was refusing to move. And the man at the table seemed to feel it too as he shifted again, this time slower, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful awareness of every eye now resting on him. Not judging loudly, not interrupting, just watching. And that kind of attention was harder to dismiss than any argument, because it did not go away when you spoke over it. It stayed, waiting, and he cleared his throat slightly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as if the gesture might buy him a moment to regain control. "I think this has gone far enough," he said, his voice measured but tighter now, the ease gone completely. And he reached for his wallet almost instinctively, placing it on the table with a quiet but deliberate motion, the familiar move of someone used to resolving discomfort with payment, with the assumption that money could close the conversation as quickly as it had opened it. But the man in the suit did not look at the wallet, did not acknowledge the gesture at all, and that absence of reaction seemed to land heavier than rejection, because it made the gesture irrelevant. And for the first time the man hesitated, his hand resting on the leather as if unsure whether to push it forward or pull it back. And across the table his friends had grown quiet, their earlier laughter gone, replaced by the kind of stillness that comes when a moment shifts beyond control. And Naomi watched it unfold with a calm she had not expected to feel, The tension that once sat heavy in her chest now replaced by something steadier, something grounded, as if the weight had moved away from her and settled somewhere else, and beside her the man in the suit finally moved his gaze, not toward the table, not toward the room, but toward the manager who had been hovering just at the edge of the scene, waiting for direction without committing to it, and that look alone was enough to draw him forward. His steps quick but careful as he approached, the practiced professionalism returning to his posture. "Is there something I can assist with?" he asked, his voice polite but edged with uncertainty, and the man in the suit did not answer immediately. Instead, he let the question sit for a brief moment before responding, his tone unchanged, calm, deliberate. "Yes," he said, and the single word carried more authority than anything else spoken that night. "I would like you to review what just happened at this table." And the manager nodded quickly, glancing between the guests and Naomi, understanding now that this was no longer a situation to smooth over, but one to address directly. And the man at the table leaned back again, a faint edge of frustration returning to his expression. "Are you serious right now?" he said, his voice no longer controlled in the same way, not loud, but strained. "This is completely unnecessary." And the man in the suit turned back to him, his gaze steady, unwavering. "What is unnecessary?" he replied. "Is assuming accountability does not apply to you." And the words did not rise, did not press, but they landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, and in that moment something shifted completely, not just in the room, not just in the table, but in the understanding of who held control, because it was no longer about who spoke first or who paid the bill. It was about who defined the standard, and that standard now stood firm, visible to everyone, and impossible to ignore. The manager nodded again, more firmly this time, as if the direction had finally become clear, and he stepped closer to the table, his attention now fully engaged, no longer divided between appeasing guests and preserving appearances, but focused on the moment itself. "Sir, I will need to understand exactly what happened," he said, his tone professional but no longer passive, and the man at the table exhaled sharply, leaning back with a quiet frustration that he could no longer disguise. "This is getting ridiculous," he replied, glancing briefly around the room as if searching for agreement that did not come, because the room had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that removed the comfort he had relied on, and beside him his friends remained silent, their earlier support fading into something more cautious, more distant, and that silence spoke louder than anything they could have said. And Naomi stood steady, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer something to be overlooked, but something that anchored the moment itself. And for the first time that night, she was not reacting. She was simply there, grounded, watching as the balance continued to tilt, and the manager turned his attention toward her briefly, his expression measured but now respectful. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name with a clarity that had not been there before. "Can you confirm what occurred?" And the simple act of being addressed directly, properly, seemed to ripple through the moment with a quiet significance, and Naomi took a breath, steady, controlled, her voice calm when she spoke. "There was no issue with the service," she said, each word clear, deliberate. "The glass was stable until it was moved." And she did not point, did not accuse. She simply stated what was true, and that truth settled into the space between them with a weight that did not require embellishment. And the man at the table shifted again, this time quicker, the tension more visible now as he responded. "Are you saying this is my fault?" he asked, his tone sharper, but the question carried less authority than it once would have, because it was no longer backed by certainty, only by resistance. And before Naomi could answer, the man in the suit spoke again, his voice cutting gently through the exchange, not interrupting but redirecting. "We are not assigning fault," he said. "We are establishing facts." And the distinction was subtle but powerful, shifting the focus away from defensiveness and toward accountability. And the manager nodded slightly, aligning himself with that framing, his posture straightening as he turned back to the table. "In that case," he said, "we will need to proceed accordingly." And the words carried a quiet finality that left little room for negotiation, and the man at the table let out a breath that was closer to a scoff than a laugh, though it lacked the confidence it once held. "You are really going to take this far?" he said. But the question felt more like disbelief than challenge, as if he had not expected the moment to continue beyond his control. And the man in the suit met his gaze without hesitation, his expression steady, composed. "It has already gone this far," he replied, and the calm certainty in his voice made it clear that the direction of the moment had been decided long before anyone realized it. And as the room absorbed that realization, the dynamic shifted completely, no longer centered on the assumption of privilege, but on the presence of principle, something quieter, stronger, and far more difficult to dismiss. The words did not echo, they settled, and once they did, the room seemed to understand that whatever came next would not return things to the way they had been. And the man at the table looked at the manager, then at the man in the suit, as if trying to measure which direction still offered him control, but there was none left to reclaim, only choices to make. And that realization showed in the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his posture shifted from relaxed confidence to something more rigid, more guarded. "So what exactly are you implying?" he asked, his tone steadier now, but carrying an edge that felt more defensive than dominant. And the manager did not hesitate this time, his voice clear. "Professional, I am implying that our staff is expected to be treated with respect," he said, and the phrasing was careful, not accusatory, but firm enough that it left no ambiguity. And the man at the table exhaled slowly, a sound that hovered between disbelief and frustration. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, though quieter now, less for the room and more for himself. And beside him one of his friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the exit, toward anything that might signal a way out of the moment without further attention. But there was no such signal, only the steady presence of the man in the suit, who now took a small step forward, not closing distance aggressively, but enough to make his position unmistakable. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was something final in it, something that did not invite negotiation. "You have two options," he said, and the simplicity of that sentence cut through the tension with precision, drawing every eye back to him. "You can acknowledge what happened and correct it, or you can choose to continue as you are and accept the consequences." And the word consequences lingered, not as a threat, but as a certainty, and the man at the table held his gaze for a moment, searching for something in his expression that might soften the outcome, but found nothing but calm resolve. And that calm, more than anything else, seemed to shift the balance entirely, because it removed the possibility of escalation and replaced it with inevitability. And for the first time since the moment began, the man looked uncertain in a way that could not be hidden, his eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi again, then away, then back, as if the act of meeting her gaze required something he had not prepared for. And the room watched in quiet anticipation, not for drama, not for spectacle, but for decision. And Naomi remained still, her hands steady now, the earlier tension replaced by a grounded calm, because the moment no longer rested on her response, it rested on his. And that shift alone changed everything. And after a long second that stretched just enough to be felt, the man leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. When he finally spoke, "If there was a misunderstanding," he began, the words careful, measured, "then it was not intentional." And though it was not an apology, it was the closest he had come to stepping away from the stance he had held all night. And the man in the suit listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his silence seemed to invite one thing, clarity. And as the room held its breath once more, it became clear that the moment had reached a point where it could no longer be avoided, only resolved. The words hung there, incomplete, careful, and for a moment the room seemed to wait, not for perfection, but for honesty. And the man in the suit did not rush to fill the silence, did not interrupt or correct, he simply watched, allowing the space to exist long enough for the truth to either step forward or retreat. And that patience, more than anything else, made the moment impossible to escape, because it required a choice, not a reaction. And the man at the table exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension he had been holding began to shift into something else, something less defensive, more aware. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weak, but stripped of the certainty it once carried. "That was not handled well," he said, the words measured, deliberate, and though they were simple, They landed differently than anything he had said before, because they did not deflect. They did not minimize. They acknowledged, and the room felt it. The subtle but undeniable shift from resistance to recognition. And Naomi heard it too. Not as a victory, not as something to celebrate, but as a correction, a moment where the balance returned to something closer to what it should have been all along. And the man in the suit nodded once, not approving, not praising, just acknowledging that the step had been taken, and then he turned slightly toward Naomi, his expression softening just enough to signal that the moment was no longer about proving a point but about restoring what had been disrupted. "Thank you," he said, and the words were directed at her, not for enduring, not for staying silent, but for holding her ground, in a way that had allowed the truth to surface without force. And Naomi inclined her head slightly, her response quiet but steady. "I am just doing my job," she said, and in that sentence there was no bitterness, no triumph, only clarity, and that clarity seemed to settle over the room like a final note, grounding everything that had unfolded into something simple, something undeniable. And the manager stepped forward again, his tone respectful now, aligned fully with the standard that had been set. "We will take care of the rest," he said, and the man at the table nodded once, not as someone conceding defeat, but as someone accepting a boundary he had not expected to encounter. And as the tension slowly released from the space, conversations began to return, softer at first, then gradually building back into the familiar hum of the restaurant. But something had changed, something subtle yet lasting. And as the man in the suit turned to leave, his presence no longer commanding attention but still carrying it quietly, Naomi watched him for a brief second, understanding without needing explanation that what had happened was not about intervention, it was about alignment, about someone choosing to stand where others had chosen to remain seated. And as she turned back to her work, her movement steady, her posture unchanged, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for applause, because the moment had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed something that could not be unseen, that dignity does not raise its voice, it does not demand space, it simply stands, and when it does, everything around it has no choice but to adjust.